Welcome back to Auto Technic for our second and final video on our manual 430 conversion. So you guys might be wondering if this is a video on a 430 manual conversion, why is there a 456 on my lift? Well, the truth of the matter is I've already completed this conversion and I've already delivered the car back to the client, and well, I'll give you guys a sneak peek. The project turned out great. The client is beyond ecstatic with the final outcome. So that's great news for us. But I actually found myself in a bit of a predicament while I was working through and editing the video. I actually planned, or I should say I filmed this video with the intentions of it being one video. And when I went through the edit, it ended up being 3 hours long, which is just entirely too long in my opinion. So I kind of split the video into a part 1 and part 2. And well, here we are now for the part 2 video. So on the part 1, we actually did quite a bit of work on the car. It's almost a 3-part series because I actually, before that, have a video where I walked you guys through the steps to remove the transmission, where you replace the clutch, where you replace the flywheel, but there are modifications that I had to make in anticipation for this conversion of converting from an F1 car to a manual car. However, that was the initial video. On the first video, really was focused on the conversion. I haven't mentioned it, but we're using a Cambio Manuale kit. And on the first video, I walked through all the steps to remove the hydraulic actuator off of the transmission, addressing all of our hydraulic lines, plugging those up, getting the new manual actuator installed onto the gearbox, and then I moved all of our attention up onto the pedal box and getting the pedal installed. Now, since my car was such a late production 2008 430, it did not have the provisions for a clutch master cylinder on the pedal box. I will say that with the Cambio Manuale kit, they do offer an option where you can take the pedal box out and they'll give you one for exchange program that has all those modifications needed, so that way it still is a true bolt-in affair. However, as we discussed in the last video, I didn't want to wait on the shipping time that was going to delay the project, and I had all the tools and skills here to take care of it myself. So I ran you guys through all the modifications that we needed to make, drilling, tapping, and really just modifying the existing pedal box to mimic an OEM gated pedal box, so that way we can install the clutch master cylinder. We had all the provisions for a clutch travel stops, attachment points for springs. It turned out pretty good. Honestly, it was a little bit of extra work that I wasn't anticipating, but it came out nice. I walked you guys through the steps for modifying the existing brake pedal. We had to cut that down, finish up the sides, and getting all of that installed in the car. And frankly, that is where we left off on the first video. So for today's video, I'm gonna continue on with the project, and you're gonna see some great content. I'm gonna walk you guys through the step on installing the shifter, shift base, shift cables, adjusting the shift cables, getting all the interior trim back in the car, modifying the center console trim, running the hydraulic line. We're going to cover getting the E-diff bled. We're going to cover getting the clutch bled. I'm actually going to show you guys some good tips on setting your fluid level in your F1 reservoir. There's some tricks to it, and really you want to be sure that you don't overfill it, so that's towards the end of the video. And also I'm going to run you guys through all the steps that we needed to make on the electrical wiring for the car. So really it's the complete conclusion of this installation of the kit, including our final road test of the car. So there's a great video in store for you guys today. Sit down, relax, and you're going to enjoy it. Now that we've finished with the installation of the pedals, it's finally time to get to the part that I've been waiting for the most, and that's getting the shift tower installed. So fortunately, we already have the seats out of the car, so we don't have to worry about those, but we still have a little bit more disassembly that we need to take care of. Mainly, we need to get the center console out of the car. So we will be taking out our F1 controls and unplugging them here with those Allen bolts. There is some hardware hidden underneath these false floors of some of these cubbies, so we'll pop those up, take that hardware out, disconnect our switches. There's also hardware here underneath the ashtray. We'll take all that out, we'll get the upper section off. For the lower section, we just have some hardware over here on the sides, just 3 pieces of hardware, and we should be able to get all that up and out of the way. In addition, we're going to take these rear carpeted panels off. We need access to our electronics, and we're going to need access over there to be running our cables through the bulkhead of the car. So I'm going to work to get that stuff disassembled real quick, and then I'll bring you guys right back once we start routing the cables in our shift tower. All right, the center console is out, and I will say that I have disassembled more of this car than you need to perform the conversion. Now, I did so because I have an additional repair I need to do to this car, or a diagnosis I should say, where we have an oil leak up here on the front of the engine, and I need to pinpoint exactly where that leak is coming from. Oil leaks in this area on 430s are incredibly common. It can be the junction of the timing cover to the cylinder head to the block, or it could be coming from the power steering pump, and it's really hard to tell on this car. So I went and removed all the trim and paneling so I can get up there. I'm going to take the power steering pump off. I'm going to clean everything up, put some trace powder on there, and actually do some diagnosis to actually figure out where the leak is coming from. I'm going through the effort to do that because based on where the leak is coming from can really dictate the repair. It's kind of a complicated situation up there with the leak in that T-junction if it is coming from the engine. So it's worth the effort to go in and properly diagnose it before I actually recommend a repair or a path forward for the customer. But I just wanted to be sure to notate to you guys that you do not need to remove all this. I did this just because I was already here and I knew that I'd be getting it off. I'll keep that completely separate from this video. I just wanted to stay focused on the F1 to manual conversion on this video. So now that we have all of this off, we can see we have the space where our shifter tower is going to mount, and our cables is really what we're going to be focusing on next. Come through here, and we need to remove that rubber plug. So I'm just going to use a little trim tool and pop that plug out from the inside. Get a couple bites. Work around the perimeter. There we go. And we have our plug out, and might be able to get you guys in there where you can see the holes that we're working with, which at first glance looks pretty big, but when you compare it to the size of our cables, not very big. So let me grab the cables and get a camera set up so we can start working and get the cables fed through our hole. Okay, so I have the cables sitting here in place, and you can see that they're pre-installed in our new grommet that is replacing the one we just took out. And here's the section that go up to the shift tower. So we have to feed all of this through with that heat shielding through that hole. Now you can see that these ends are actually pretty large and nearly the diameter of the hole that we have to feed them through. So there's no way that we're going to feed these both through at the same time. We're going to have to stagger them like that. So we're going to feed one cable through and get it to the thinnest section of the cable in the hole. Then we're going to work to get the second cable fed through. Now I do have a bit of an advantage because I have my engine panel out, so I might be able to get my hand in there and reach to kind of feed the cables through. And we're leaving the heat shielding back because we want this to be as thin as possible. Once I get both cables through to where the thinnest part of the hole is right here around the cables, I'll work the heat shielding through, and I'm just going to work to slide all the cabling through and get this plug installed in the hole, and then we'll just continue all of our attention up here at the front. So I'm going to set you guys down to hopefully where you can have a vantage point, and we're going to work this cabling through the hole. All right, so you can see we have a pretty good access now. So I'm just going to work this first cable through, and there's two holes essentially. There's a front section of the metal we need to go through and a back section. So I have that cable through, and there's the rear hole. It does not run parallel to this front one. It's at a bit of an angle, but I have the cable all the way through. So now come around and work our second cable through. This is where it gets pretty tight. There we go. All right, so here's where we're at with our cables. We have both of the ends through both holes in our bulkhead. And as I was feeding the second one through, I could feel it hitting one of the rubber water hoses on the bottom side of the car. So I actually stopped right here. I got underneath the car, and I was sure that I had the cables routed correctly past those water hoses. So that way, when I feed them all the way through, there's no interference issues, and I don't have to deal with it after the fact. It was definitely worth it. Just pause and get my eyes under there and get a good quick visual. Once the car is back up on the lift, I'll show you guys what I was talking about. But now that I know that's sorted, I know we're free to feed the cabling all the way through with our heat shields. Going to be as careful as I can so that way I don't dent or damage this heat shielding. It is pretty easy to bend, and I want to keep it looking as nice as I can. So I'm going to continue to feed the cables through the hole. I'm actually going to stop a little bit short and not install the plug. That is based on the instructions from Cambio Manuale. They recommend not to do that until we have this end of the cables connected up to our shifter tower and the other end connected up to our gearbox. We make our initial adjustments. Then they say push this plug through the firewall and then make our final adjustments. And let's get this cable fed through. All right, so cables are fed through. We stopped our rubber plug. It's just kind of sitting in the hole for now. Now the cables need to route up underneath the e-brake, and it's held on with these three 13mm bolts right back there. So I'm going to loosen those up, get this moved. I also need to get some of this wiring moved out of the way so the shift tower can sit here. This is our old connector here that we're not going to be reusing. That was for the F1 switch panel, so we can just move that out of the way. And I think for the most part, this wiring and our reverse light switch wiring, we'll get that popped over, and we'll have to clean our butyl tape off. Get that stuff cleaned. There we go. So I'm just going to leave the wiring off to the side, and we'll get the e-brake moved, and that's going to let us get our cables connected to the shift tower bolted down. Once all that's set in place and established, we'll come back and tidy up and locate all of our wiring. All right, here's where we're at. The e-brake is unbolted, and I just laid it off to the side, so now we don't have to worry about the routing of the cables there. You can see that I have the shift tower just sitting in here. It's not bolted in yet. And I did so because I wanted to confirm which way the cables need to be routed in relation to this wire harness. I wanted to know if the cables should run under it or over it, and it seems pretty clear that underneath the harness is the right way to go. So I'm going to have to route the cables up here underneath this harness into the receptacle of the shift tower, and then making our connections on the bottom side. Now they do call out in the instructions that they want the blue cable on the top side sitting here, and you can see that this one's marked with blue tape, and that is the one that goes on our outer stud, and this cable goes on the center shifter ball. So if we take our shift tower, I'll show you. So I have it sitting basically how it is in the car, and you can see that this cable needs to go on the outside or the right side, so it connects onto this cable, and this other cable that has the eyelet here is going to go on and connect onto that stud. So I'm going to have to work to route the cables. Get the shift tower moved. I'm going to have to route the cables underneath this harness, and I'm going to set everything over there with my shift tower. That way I can get the cables installed. I can get them all attached. I'm going to pre-lubricate everything again with that Siliglide, get everything bolted down and torqued, and then I can move the shift tower in the position and get it bolted down and kind of feed the cables back this way. And from there it should be pretty easy to get the e-brake back in the position. So I'm going to get that taken care of real quick, and I'll bring you guys right back. Alright, here's where we're at. We have the cables installed to the shift tower. So you can see I had to cross them since it's upside down. I have them underneath my wire harness, and I have them right into the receiving grooves here in the shift tower. Now I will say on this cable right here, I did have to unscrew this fitting from the end because it was larger than the hole we have here. So I unscrewed it, ran the cable through, then put it back on. Pretty straightforward here. Just take that 10mm nut off on this one, slide it on. Again, put a little bit of grease on everything. It's all lubed up. So now I'm going to flip this over, get the shift tower bolted down, and then we can get these cables inserted in and the retaining clips in place. All right, there we have it. The shift tower is installed. Cables are seated, retaining clips are in, routed underneath our e-brake bracket, down into the plug, going through the bulkhead, and everything's looking great so far. Very nice actuation, as one would expect. And I think for now, we're pretty much done on the inside. The only things we really have left to do are to connect the cables at the gearbox. We still need to run our hydraulic clutch line, and then we have all of the electronics to worry about. But I think right now I'm going to get the car closed back up, get it pushed forward again, get it back on the rack and get it up in the air, and let's finish off these shift cables. Alright, so we got the car back up on the lift, and now we can get a good shot of our cables, and we can see where they're coming through the holes there in our bulkhead. And these are the coolant hoses that I was mentioning that I wanted to be sure I got the cables that kind of ducked down and underneath. I didn't want them on top of it because I didn't want to deal with taking the hoses off and correcting that. But you can see that I have them just kind of sitting in here in place. They're just loosely sitting in this bracket. I was just kind of eyeballing it to see how it all worked. Now, I will say that this lower hard line coming into this union was interfering with this fitting here. So I just took a brass drift and a hammer and just kind of tapped it up, and it actually bent in and reshaped quite nicely so I could get that worked up and in there. And we have our cables loose off of the actuator back here for now. So I don't see any reason not to put in our clips and get our cables locked in the position here. And the kit did come with 2 of these Adele clamps that we can use to secure the cables, kind of similar to how the factory does it. I do think I'm going to use them right here and get the first one mounted up here off that boss right there, off of the front of the oil pan. And then I've been eyeballing it back here. I'm not sure if I'm going to try to tie in up here where this spacer mounts or off of the oil water pump here. Not 100% positive, but I'm actually not really going to worry about that at the moment. I think what I'm going to do is get my cables connected here and then make my initial connections here at the back of the car. We'll have to do some mock-up with the shifter so that way we can get those set up. And then I will feed the plug into the bulkhead so that's finalized. And after I get that done, I think at that point I'm going to run the clutch hydraulic line, because if I can run that line with these cables and these clamps, I think that would look nice and tidy, and obviously use these clamps to keep it secure. So I think we're going to pause on getting the cables secured up nice and tight, and I'm going to focus my attention now. I'm just going to get these locked in and secured real quick, and I'll bring you to the top side and show you what we need to do to the shifter. Alright, so I'm going to try out the adjustment procedure that Cambio Manuale calls out in the instruction manual. I've never adjusted the shifters this way, so I figure it might as well give it a shot and see how accurate and how well it works out. So the first step that they give us is to use some small pieces of these rubber fuel line, and we have the shifter essentially locked in between third and fourth gear. So I have these slid into the shifter gate in fourth gear and third gear here. Shifter's locked firm. Now we need to jump to the back of the car and attach our eyelet to our actuator. Alright, so with our shifter locked in position, we're going to be working on this upper arm, and we want to be sure that we're in neutral, so I can push that forward. I can feel the detent, that's neutral, and back. So we want that right there in the neutral position. Now, I will say that this hardware has nylock lock nuts on them, and I've found through past experience when adjusting the shift cables, it makes a lot more sense to just swap those out with a regular nut. And then once you have your adjustments locked in where you want them, I take this off and put the nylock back on. It makes things a lot easier and quicker back here rather than trying to tighten that down all the time. Plus, they're not as effective when you use them that many times. So, we have the upper cable that we're working on, and I've already loosened the jam nut on this cable, and all I'm going to do is just spin my cable out until I can get it to freely and smoothly attach onto that bolt. We'll swap our nut out like I mentioned with the one that I can't find right now. Here we go. We'll swap it out with that guy, and I'll just get it hand tight for now, and then we'll go back to the car and see how it actuates. Alright, there we go. I will say that these also have a split lock washer on them, and I took that off on the upper side, and I actually just have that in hand tight, but it's still plenty tight. And one thing to note on these adjustments, even half of a turn on this heim joint makes a pretty big difference. So I'm only just getting them close right now, and then when we're done with all of the work and all the interiors back in, I'll finalize all my shifter adjustments. But for now, let's jump up to the top of the car again and see how it actuates. Alright, take out our hose, and that feels pretty good from the hit. Alright, let's move on to the other cable. So the procedure for our lower cable is to lock our shifter into fourth gear, and then we'll make our adjustments down at the actuator. Okay, so if I'm interpreting their instructions correctly, we have the shifter locked in the fourth gear, and we now have this play in this lower lever. From what I interpret from the instructions, I need to find the middle point of this play and then connect this lower bolt to the eyelet. So we'll adjust our eyelet to make that match. So I'll probably use these paint marks up here, the torque stripes that I put on, and I can kind of eyeball where the halfway point is, and I'll hook up our heim joint and we'll see how it works out. I'm not sure I'm fully following on this, but I have nothing to lose by giving it a shot. So let's see how it plays out. Well, look at that. Their procedure worked pretty great. Although there is still one thing I need to go back and correct, and it's really this blue cable. If we look at it here, look at how my jam nut is pretty much all the way to where the threads end on the cable. I don't have enough adjustment at the back end to actually fully extend the cable. Right now there's probably like one thread in the heim joint, so I did that just to be sure that this was working correctly. So I'm gonna have to disconnect the heim joint at the back, loosen this jam nut. I'll probably have to take this fitting off down here, and I'm gonna have to give this more thread and push the cable rearward, and then that's gonna allow me to have plenty of thread engagement at the heim joint at the rear of the car. But the adjustment procedure that Cambio Manuale gives me It worked out pretty good. Granted, I haven't gotten the car to where I can run it yet and run it through the gears. So this is just the base adjustment. I'm good with this because we have to take the shifter gate off. And this is actually what dictates all of your gates and your gears in the transmission. And we have all the trim to put back on. So what I'm saying is I'm going to just make this small adjustment to the cable now because I won't have access once everything's installed. But I'm only going for my rough adjustments. We have those. Then once I'm finally assembled with the car, I can start the car and I can run it on the lift, run it through the gears. And then we'll finalize our adjustments back at the back of the transmission, really make sure everything's good, put on our lock nuts and lock washers. So I'm going to get this taken care of, and I think I'm going to call it a day. It's been a pretty long one out here today. We made great progress. So I'm going to see you guys back out here tomorrow. Morning, guys. So we finished yesterday off strong. We had a lot of great momentum getting the shifter in, our cables in, everything adjusted. We're able to row through the gears, and let's see if we can't keep that momentum today and make some great progress on this conversion. I think where I'm going to start today is with our clutch hydraulic line. It is really time to get that installed now that I have the master cylinder in, our shift cables in, everything's sorted. So basically I have the starting point for the cables established, the finishing point established at the gearbox, and all the cables installed so I know what I need to work around so that way it looks nice. And we have two main cables we need to worry about. This is our feed line from our brake fluid reservoir to our clutch master cylinder. Now, I will say that I made one change on this from how it came from Cambio Manuale, and they had a standard hose clamp on the end of this fitting. It was this guy right here, and I didn't like it. I just thought it didn't look as finished and intentional as I wanted. So I put in a ear clamp right here, which I just use a pair of CV clamp pliers to squeeze that in and crimp it in place. And I'm not worried about serviceability here because we have this banjo bolt that we just unbolt, and this can be more of a permanent fitting. And on the other end of this hose where it goes to the fluid reservoir, I'll just use the existing hose clamp that's on the plug that is on the stock reservoir so we can use the factory hardware. So that was really the only change I made there. And then we have our braided stainless steel clutch line that they provide in the kit. There's this heat shielding here, and they give us some of these P-clamps so we can get everything mounted and secured. So I'm really taking advantage of this because the car is still on the lift right now. The other big part of this job we need to do is the electronics, but it'll be really nice to do the electronics with the car off the lift and the doors open. So installing this clutch line is pretty straightforward. I think this is one of the areas where it's really subjective on where and how you route it. So I think my plan of attack here is to work to get it installed, because it's going to take me some time figuring and thinking and figuring out what I think is best for the routing so it looks nice, it's functional, we keep it away from heat. So I'm probably just going to focus on getting it installed from where we're at now. And then once it's fully installed, I'll bring you guys back and give you an overview, and I can explain what I did versus trying to bring you guys along as I'm sitting here kind of trying to think and routing it, because inevitably I'm going to route it, look at it, not like it, route it a different way, look at it, maybe like it, maybe not, maybe reroute it again. And that's just going to be tedious and I think a little bit boring to watch. So I really think the value here is just seeing how I routed it. So I'm going to get it installed, and I'll bring you guys back to show you how it all turned out. All right, so I just finished up with the installation of both my hydraulic lines. Now, I'll say that I started with my pressure line coming from the master cylinder back to the union block on the gearbox. And I initially started by getting that line routed or selecting where it was going to come up into this front cavity, which you can see it comes up right there with those existing bundles of wire harness. And I'll show you once we're under the car, but those are more so towards the right side of the car or the passenger side. And once I had that established under the car, I actually did all the routing essentially from the gearbox forward. Now I did so because that line has maybe 8-10 inches of extra length than I ideally really needed for the way that I routed it. And rather than have that extra length back in the engine bay where it's just going to be more susceptible to the heat from the exhaust and the headers and not look as good, I ran it back there sanitary and cleanly, ran it forward. Then once we got up into here, that's where I had that extra length, and I basically routed it in a way to consume that length. And I did pretty intentional to that way you can't see the wiring, or the hose I mean. And I know that it's unlikely that anyone will really be in here and see it, and it doesn't really matter, but I really just wanted it routed cleanly and nicely. So I move my light, you can look in there and you really can't see where that hose is routed, but I'll show you guys. So it's routed up over here where it bundles in with our wire harness. You might be able to see a little bit of it back there behind those hoses. And then it ties into the existing wire harness back here. There is a P-clamp, or an Adele clamp, back here that holds that wire harness back to the chassis of the car. And I actually loosened that clamp up. I can't get the camera in there. It's right behind this vent hose, or this vacuum hose for the brake booster. There we go. So I took that clamp off. I ran the stainless line through that clamp. And then I actually dropped it underneath the steering column. It's actually more towards the pedal box underneath this bracket. And then it kind of routes up over here on the side, and then it darts under our wiper motor and then curls back, and you can see the union right there coming into our master cylinder. So it's definitely taken a long way around. Let's see if I can get you guys under here where you can see it. You can see it curling up right there, and it kind of curls and loops back behind the brake booster. So it is not touching anything back there. It's not rubbing, and it consumed all the extra length. And like I mentioned, I just put a little bit of extra effort into it, so that way it's ran intentionally. It looks nice. I try to route it with other wiring and bundling, just for a sanitary installation. It just looks a lot nicer in my opinion versus if you pull all this stuff down and find a bunch of coiled up hose. I don't like that. So once I had that done and routed, then I shifted over to our line from the master cylinder to the reservoir. And this one is a little bit more straightforward. You can see them right there. I ended up cutting about 4 inches off of it, and I have that banjo fitting. It's kind of back at a rearward angle that give the line enough room to curl and make the bend up to the reservoir. I used the existing hose clamp that was on the reservoir for the rubber cap. Again, we have our ear clamp here, plenty of space to tighten down both banjos for our pressure and feed lines. To get all of our tooling in there, we're set. Got all that done. Everything's tightened down. I did have to reorient the alarm siren to clear the master cylinder, but that's pretty straightforward. Got that taken care of. And everything up here is really set and taken care of. So let's get the car in the air, and I'll drop you underneath and show you the rest of the routing. All right, so we're up here at the front of the car, and you can see where our hose routes down with our existing wire harness here. Now, there is this reinforcement plate. It's actually that guy over there. I ended up taking that off so I could route this through. I really don't see a way on a 430 that you're going to route this line through without taking that off. But I took that off, and the kit came with 3 smaller P-clamps for this hose. So I unbolted this bracket, and if you actually look, I was able to position that P-clamp up in there through this bolt hole, and that's retaining the hose in this position. It was a tight fit, but it holds it nice and secure. And you can see that I was able to keep this ran very cleanly all the way down. Again, another P-clamp here on this bracket. And it just follows our wire harness down here. Get my chair over my lift. And it was nice that they gave me 3 of those P-clamps, the one for each bracket. Granted, I have plenty here if I needed to add more. And then once that ran through here, I kept it zip tied. These are the same high heat zip ties that the factory uses back on our heat shielding on the gearbox, like our E-diff solenoids, all these right over here. So these are going to withstand the environment. Got the shift cables here, and I just threw a zip tie around with right there, the same thing. And the shift cables run through. You can't really see on the top side, but there's our brake hose, and that has the heat shielding that comes in the kit, which is critical. You need to make sure that you get that covered. It comes up in here to our Adele clamp, and this is one of the larger ones that came with the kit. And you can see I just used that existing boss and a piece of hardware to bolt it up in there and just kind of positioned it where it needs to be, where everything wants to naturally flow. And again, we got both shift cables and our clutch line over here, another high temp zip tie right there. And this is where I had to deviate the clutch line to come up and over the oil filter, because really the fitting up here needed that. So there's so much material here that if I tried to bend this down underneath the filter, it just really kinked the line and it wasn't going to work. So it got routed up and over. And then both shift cables down here where they separate into our bracket. And this Adele clamp was not one that came with the kit. It's one that I had. I actually took it, put it in the vise, and bent this end 90 degrees so I could use this bolt on our oil tube, our oil transfer tube here, to get that secured. And that only has the 2 shift cables. So I actually did step this one down a size versus the one that came with the kit. So I got that in there set. All of our heat shields here for the cables are in position where we want them. And we got our heat shielding up here, zip tied. Everything's tightened down and torqued. Bleed screws. So we're pretty well set back here. The cables are routed where I wanted them. Our hydraulic line is routed where it needs to be. And I do need to go back into the car now and push our rubber grommet all the way through now that I have the cables where I want them. And once I have that done and most of the interior trimmed back together, I will come back here and rerun through the adjustment of our shift cables, because I know that that might change a little bit as things kind of get a little bit more stressed as they get put in place. So that's kind of going to be the last thing I do, is come back and adjust the shift cables, and obviously we're going to have to drive the car and make sure everything's good and potentially readjust them from that point. So where we're at with this is essentially I have all the mechanicals in for this conversion. We have everything back on the transmission installed, the shifters installed, the clutch pedal, everything's there. We got everything that we need done. I need to move forward and bleed the clutch master cylinder so that way we can operate the clutch and the electronics. That's the only two things we have left to do. Now, as for the bleeding the clutch master cylinder, on this car, I also have to do a biannual service. So I'm going to be bleeding the brakes as well. And I'm going to be bleeding the brakes with my Leonardo tester so I can run through the ABS cycle, meaning I kind of need the seat in the car so I can sit in the car and actuate the pedals. I need all my electronics and everything's connected. So with where the car is at right now, I'm not ready to do that. Since I'm trying to keep this video dedicated to the installation of this kit, I think I'm going to just pause now in this video. I'm going to jump over. I'm going to take care of those items, and then once I get those stuff done, and we start getting the interior put back together and where we go through and bleed the clutch, I'll bring you guys back so we can wrap up the last of those tasks and finish out this conversion. All right, well, welcome back, and we've got everything else on the car to a point where it's now time for me to shift my focus and attention back to this manual conversion. Now, I know that I discussed that I was going to make a dedicated video to the electronics on the car, but actually I was looking through the instructions and what I really need to do to get this all converted over, and it's pretty minimal. There's really not a lot there, and I don't think there's enough there to dedicate it to its own video, so I just made the decision to add it all into this video. So for our electronics, there's essentially two things that we're going to be worrying about. One of them is we have to eliminate the TCU, or the transmission control unit, so we're just going to unplug that and remove it from the car. But all the other control units in the car via the CAN system are going to be expecting to see the TCU there. So if we just unplugged it, we'd have a lot of problems. So to work around that, we're going to be using this TCU bypass delete, and this is from Scud ING Swiss, and this essentially is going to be a plug-and-play solution to eliminate our TCU. Ironically, that plugs into our EDIF control unit, so I just unplug a connector from the EDIF control unit, plug that connector in, and that's going to allow everything on the CAN system, so we're talking our ABS, instrument cluster, our NCMs, to think that the TCU is still there and functioning properly. Essentially, those control units are going to know no different, that this car is no longer an F1 equipped car. So there is other ways we could go about doing this. We could go through and reprogram the cluster and the NCMs as if they were a manual configuration car, to where they're not looking for the TCU. But this is what Cambio Manuale gave it the kit. I kind of want to give this a shot, see how it drives, and go from there. I know there's a lot of really strong aftermarket solutions on software for better mapping and programming of things, but it's hard to know how good those are until we try this method first. So on top of that, we need to do a little bit of rewiring for our F1 pump, essentially, so that way it still operates since the TCU is taken out of the car. So the kit comes with our basic wiring here. We basically have 6 wires that we need to add, this one being a ground wire, and then 5 wires that we need to add and repin into the car. And that's all we're going to have to take care of. So there's one thing I will say. The instructions for this kit and adding these wires call out for us to cut the wire harness and solder those wires in. I'm not a fan, to tell you the truth. It doesn't matter that if it's on a Ferrari or really any modern car, I do not like cutting the wire harnesses. It's really a last resort option for me, and I will go through pretty decent lengths to avoid that, which we're going to do today. So I've already kind of looked at it. I have a pretty good game plan. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to be able to get all this connected and not have to cut any wiring. So my plan here really is to work to get this stuff in place. You know, these already have the pins crimped onto them where we have to put them into the connector. And then we're going to have to deal with this other end where they want us to cut and solder, which I just mentioned. I'm going to work around that. My plan of attack is to work to get all of this stuff in and connected. It's going to take some figuring. I'm real picky. I want the wiring to be routed so you can, again, same thing, same theme, right? So that way you can't tell that this has been added in. So I think I'm just going to work to get this all set up and installed. I won't have it all tidied and tuck away. Once I'm able to work through the problems that I encounter during this install, I'll bring you guys back and show you what we ended up with, where I made the connections, and how I made it all work. So I'll see you guys back here in a second. All right, so we're partially wired up, and I figured I'd stop and bring you guys up to speed with what I have done so far. Now for starters, this right here is our eDiff ECU, and that's really where a lot of the wiring is going to be taking place. So there's two connections on it, and I have unplugged them. So this is the upper connection that plugs into the top spot right there. And then this actually goes to our TCU delete, but the existing plug looks similar, and it goes right in that spot. So you can see where they're marked with yellow paint pins. There is an open spot down at the bottom that snaps into, but that remains open. So just be aware of that. So we have those unplugged. Now for our TCU delete, I have it attached right over here. I will say the instructions show it to be sitting on this ledge up there, but since we have a spider, we have this roll bar that mounts there, and I'm not able to get it up there. And there is kind of a nook further in the back, but I'm limited on the length of the wiring for this TCU delete, where I could not mount it back there. So I figured that this was the best position for it as a compromise. And to attach it to the car, I used one of my favorite products here. This is 3M Dual Lock, so it's, I would say, like a modern style Velcro. It's just like nylon little hooks on this double-sided tape, and it attaches to itself, and it like snaps into place very nicely. So it doesn't really wear out like Velcro, and also the adhesive on it's really strong. So I've had great success with it. Really like this stuff. So I just used a little bit of that, get that mounted up there, and that's great. Now I've already taken the lower connector that was in our eDiff control unit and plugged it into the TCU delete, so that's taken care of. And then we have this wire here, which I have yet to plug into the eDiff control unit. I'm just kind of waiting until I'm done with all my electrical work. Now, like we said, that was plug and play. So we just have to mount it, plug in the factory wire harness to it, and then we're going to have to plug this in. Pretty simple. The wiring part of this, we do on the upper connector, and you have to add 5 pins to this upper connector. So you can see down here, these are the 2 pins that I've added right here. The yellow and the blue, these go to our F1 relay. We'll talk about those in a second. Over here, the other 3 wires we add, which I think was, what, green, blue, and red? Yep. You can see that I added this nylon sleeving over all the wires. It just really makes it look a lot cleaner. And then I heat shrink the ends of them. And I will say that this heat shrink that I use is waterproof heat shrink. Not that I need it to be waterproof here in this application, but the material that they have in it that's like that waterproofs it essentially is like a glue that really helps hold it in place. So I really like that. But I added those 3 wires where they tell you, and I will mention that there is a lock that you have to spread off on this connector, and that allows your terminals to go in a lot easier. And also, they're so deep, you can't push them all the way in, and they're kind of, you have to snap them in. So once I get them where I can't go any further, rather than push on the wire, I take a small pick tool, and I can get on the back side of the metal connector, push them all the way forward, and get them in place. And then you just want to look on the front side to make sure they match. Their depth matches the OEM ones. So you can see all the pins that I've added in it. There's 1 right there, and then that whole row down there, and I think 2 on the bottom. And this bundle of wire here goes to the other side of the car where we're going to make our connections to the existing wire harness where the F1 TCU was. But I'm going to leave all of this here for now. We're not going to worry about that. And I don't have this plugged in because I'm dealing with the wiring, and I don't want to have basically any power or any current through everything. So I'm just leaving it unplugged for now. But I kind of held this in position, and I was able to figure out where this wiring goes, and these 2 wires go over here to where our F1 relay sits. Now this is what I was showing you where I don't like to cut and modify things. So the instructions tell you to cut these wires right here. This pin would be in this connector, and then you're going to solder this blue wire to that connector. I don't like doing that, so you can see that I removed the factory pin from this terminal block. So we're completely open on the back side. There's no extra wiring. Again, when you do this, there's usually a safety lock right here that you have to get open. See if I can get that open with my hand. One-handed. There we go. Open again. So you have to make sure you have that opened up, and then you need a special tool to go in through these openings to get the pins out. So you can get them pretty cheap, a variety of tools on Amazon. Really, they're just all different shapes and styles, and I think it's a little bit of a learned skill to kind of know where the tab is at, to get the feel for it, to work everything out. Truth be told, years ago, I made this tool out of an old wiper blade. When I worked at BMW, though, it's a wiper blade insert, and you can see that I shaved the end of it down, and this tool actually works better than most other tools that I come across. It's just the right size. I can get it in there, and I push the tool in, the push our locking tab out, and then I gently pull on the back side to pull the wiring out. So I only depinned this small blue and black wire right here and this orange wire. So these clearly, you can tell by the size of the wires, are the control side of the relay, and these much thicker wires are actually the activation wires that go to the pump. So what we're doing here is these two wires were controlled by our F1 TCU, which I've already removed, that was over there. Now, since that's gone, we need something that's going to activate our F1 pump so we can still operate our eDiff. And that's where this wiring that's coming out of your eDiff control unit is just going to come over here, take place of these two wires, and run it. Now, I went and dug through my connector set, and I have these terminals here that you can see that I've crimped on, and I use a 360-degree crimper to get those crimped so they're nice and tight. And I've already test fit these up into the connector. They fit in nice and tight. Once I lock my locking tab over, they lock in place, and I'm able to get the relay on. So I can just take these, I'll install these, get everything locked in, and you can see here I use a piece of heat shrink to terminate these so we don't have to worry about them touching things, shorting, or grounding. I've already done this one. I have not done this one. So you can see I overhang it so they're safe. So once I get the heat shrink on the other wire, I'll just secure these back to the harness out of the way like that. And we'll have these wires feed into there, and this whole unit bolts on right there. So I'll get all that taken care of, get that wiring cleaned up. I'll find a clean way to route our other wiring across the car to get it to our connectors to where our F1 ECU was. So I'm going to get this finalized, get our wiring routing, and I'll bring you guys back once we're making our connections on the other side of the car. All right, so I got the wiring all straightened out. I just have one last connection to make after I show you guys what I ended up doing. Honestly, it all turned out really well. I'm quite happy with it. So I routed the wiring from the driver's side over below, kind of following along with this wire harness. You can kind of see a little glimmer of it right there. And that sheathing that I put on it really helps it all blend in, so you can't really tell that it's been added in. But my wiring runs up and just follows this wire harness over. It's tucked down on the back side, comes over here, and it drops down right here on this box, and then it splits where some of the wires come down here, as you can see them, and this other wiring comes up here at the top. So this is our right hand NCM. I've already removed the TCU. It was bolted right in front of it, and these are our TCU connectors. Now we had to make 5 connections over here, or I should say we had 5 wires over here. We had to make 4 connections. So one of the wires actually was a ground, which I have it grounded right there on that bolt, and you can maybe see it coming out a little bit. So I actually cut the ear terminal off that was on that one because it had blue heat shrink on it, and it definitely screamed aftermarket. Put on a ring terminal with no heat shrink, and then put the black heat shrink back on it with our nylon sleeving so it blends in and looks factory. So that's pretty easy, and then that leaves us, since we have that one ground goes to one of the wires that came over, one of the 5, that leaves 4 wires remaining. And you can see that I've already made my connections here. There's 2 down there and 2 up here. So let's talk about how I made these connections. And it's kind of the same thing that I did over here on the driver's side. And I ended up taking these back shells off of our connectors that went to our TCU. I slid my lock out, and I was able to depin my pins, so you can see it's right there where it has the weather pack. And I have this one connected so I can show you how they're together, but I had enough of the male pins right here that I was able to crimp onto the wiring that feeds it over to our new wiring that we put into the eDiff ECU. So they just slide in. It's a pretty tight fit. Now, since I don't have a connector, they'll positively lock these 2 terminals together. They're only held together with a friction fit. That's really where this heat shrink comes in key. So that waterproofing heat shrink I talked about earlier, if you look right there on the edge, you can see where that sealant or kind of glue oozes out once you heat it up. And that creates such a strong bond that I can't pull this out. So I know that using this heat shrink and this method works great. I've used it all the time, and it is still completely reversible. You just have to carefully cut this heat shrink off, and then you'll be left with your factory female terminal that you could reconnect back in your connector if you ever wanted to go back. So essentially, I did the same thing over here with all 4 connections. So I was able to get all of this installed without cutting or splicing into the factory wiring harness. It is 100% reversible in a manner that won't be detectable that it was done. That's key. A lot of people advertise that something's reversible. I like to do it where it's reversible and undetectable. Now, I also took a couple minutes and worked our rubber plug all the way through, which that actually took a fair amount of work. And I will say that my cables ended up getting flipped. So the cable that's supposed to be on top right here, which is our blue cable, the left side cable, ended up being on the bottom. So I had to take it back out and do it again. And I kind of cleaned up the wiring over here. So I took a couple minutes. You can release the locking tab on these zip ties on the back side right there, and you can pull the zip tie back out. And this is the wiring that went to our F1 control panel. And I just routed it all the way up, and I loosened it, put the connector up there, and I just bundled it with all the factory zip ties to clean it up. And I'll bring you guys around to the other side of the car, because we cleaned up some of the wiring over there as well. So for starters, on this side of the car, we had this wiring because it has an aftermarket stereo. So I did the same thing. I added that into the bundling of the zip ties, got all of this stuff cleaned up. I got our reverse switch plugged in. Remember, this was just kind of attached up here and left unplugged. So that's plugged in. I've gone back through and torqued all this hardware to the shift tower. E-brakes torqued down, cleaned up all of our wiring. This goes back to our speaker box, and this goes to all of our switches in the console. So really, we are all taken care of and set up here. There's really nothing more I need to do. All the electronics are in. All the wiring's buttoned up. You can see over here, I'll probably finish off that connection. I just left that one unheat shrunk, and then I'll zip tie that together so I could show you. Then I'll need to plug everything in over here, and then I'll be done electrically. And I think at that point, the next step, since we've made our initial adjustments on our shifter cables, and I know that they're good, I've already had to adjust them up with the shifter, I can start working to get the center console back in and the seats back in. I'm going to leave everything free and clear or off in the back of the car because I want to do that at the last minute for my oil leak diagnosis. Again, that's not related to what we're doing here, but I'm just mentioning it so you kind of know what my plan of attack is. Now for our center console here, since we have a spider, I don't have to make any modifications to this piece. Really, all my modifications are going to have to be up here with this cubby to make it clear our shift tower. So I'm going to continue on getting this interior reassembled as much as I can, and once I get to a point where I need to make a modification or alter something from a basic reassembly standpoint, then I'll bring you guys back and walk you guys through those steps. Alright, so the interior is coming together quite nicely. We have the front seats back in. I have the lower section of the center console reinstalled, and that was just a drop-in, plug-and-play, nothing to note there. I have the upper section reinstalled, and there are two metal brackets that were up here that held the F1 switches in that I needed to remove to clear the shift tower. Those brackets, fortunately, just bolt in with some small 8mm bolts right here, and zip those off real quick. And then once those are off, it allowed me to get that fully reinstalled. So you can see that I got my cubbies installed in the back and all my switches, got my wiring sorted, the e-brake boot back on, and really, we are now ready for the upper section of the cubby, or the trim. Now, since this is a spider, this is where our modifications take place, and this is our trim here. It had this extra cubby off to the side, and then all of our F1 controls sat in that area. So if we take this back to the car, we can see the clear problem where that cubby is going to hit the shift trim. So this opening here is good, and we basically need to take these two rectangles and make one large rectangle out of them. Now, on our kit, it has this trim here, and this trim sits right there. So once we're done cutting it, this is going to cover it up, but you can see that it doesn't slide in place. Now, if we look at this edge and reveal here, it's pretty thin, and it matches this edge and reveal here. So it's not the cubby that's preventing it from going in, it's actually this lip that sits right here that was retaining our F1 shift plate. So if you look, it's actually that's hitting those ears that stand up on the piece. So I'm going to have to make some provisions here so that way these slide in and then this will sit flush. Now for our cubby, we're going to have to cut this cubby off, and if I spin this around, you can see that there's a small lip around the existing opening that's on there. So I think I would like to cut this and try to mimic that lip as much as I could, so this just looks uniform and kind of intentional. And I was checking out some of my supplies, and I have 1/4-inch fine line tape and 1/8-inch fine line tape. As it turns out, this 1/8-inch fine line tape, if I rest it on the face, is pretty much the same height as that lip that's there. So I'm going to take this tape I'm going to wrap it all the way around the bottom, getting it flush, and that's basically going to give me my cut line all the way around this cubby piece. So I'm going to work to get this cubby cut off all the way around the perimeter. I'm going to have to take my cigarette lighter out and these switches out so I don't have to worry about working around them and don't have to worry about damaging them. Once that cubby is off, I'll make my modifications here to clear our tabs, and then I'll be able to set this trim on no problem. And I want to do so then when I make these cuts, I'm sure that I cut them far enough in where you don't see them sticking out of this trim. But I also want to cut them square. Like, I don't want to cut it up here where you can see that it looked modified. So again, with the theme of everything that I'm doing, and I want to spend a little bit of time, get this cut and modified so it doesn't look like it was cut and modified to the best of my abilities. So I'm going to take a couple minutes, see if I can't get this cut and modified. I got my two tools that I think are going to work best. I have my pneumatic air saw here, and I have a cutoff wheel with my die grinder. Although I'm going to give it a best effort with this saw because I think I'll have the most control with this on making a precise, clean cut versus this grinder. But we just got to get into it and see what we're going to do. So I'm going to work to get this modified, and we'll see how it turns out. All of our trimming on our carbon fiber insert is complete, and you can see what we're left with here. And I did my best to make it, like I said, as factory as possible, but like on these ends right here, I left more material there, which doesn't make it look as factory, but I did so because I didn't want any of my cuts to kind of show from underneath this, so I had to play it safe and leave them a little bit long towards the inside. Everything was pretty straightforward on getting it cut. The only exception from what I had to do versus what I was expecting were on these sides right here. I actually had to shave those down quite a bit. If you look, they're almost razor sharp on the back side, which I tried to knock that edge off so they aren't so sharp. But I really had to widen this opening to allow this piece to fit in without really having to force and press it in. I wanted it to obviously be as snug as I could so it's not loose, but I didn't want to have to really just forcefully install it. So just spent a little time, worked that out, got it taken care of. And this piece is actually just held into the car basically by clamping pressure with our shifter plate up here that sits on top and our ashtray here with that bolt hole in the bottom that sits in there. So we'll basically secure this and this to the car, which holds this in place. We have everything laid out. So we have our shifter gate, our knob, our trim. It's all ready to go back in the car. But let's take a second and talk about our shifter gate, because this is the one that comes with the Cambio Manuale kit, and it's essentially an exact clone or replica of the factory piece, with the exception that there's not a cavallino up here. Now, that's obviously a copyright issue with Ferrari and why they can't include that with the kit. So, this particular client was able to source a factory Ferrari shift gate, and you can see our cavallino up there. So we're going to be installing this at this time. This one's not going into the car. Now, I will say that this is one of the reasons why I did not really chase the perfect shifter adjustment when we initially were going through our adjustments, and that's because I knew I was going to be installing the shift gate, and I did not want to have this shift gate installed till the very last. Basically, I wanted to run through all the mock-up and test fitting at the Cambio Manuale gate, just in case something happened, and make sure I can keep the Ferrari one preserved nice, neat, and clean. Now, theoretically, they should be identical to one another dimensionally, so there should be no issues with my adjustments by swapping from gate to gate. But I really just want to be sure that when I finalize all my shifter adjustments, the car is fully assembled, how it's going to be when the client's driving it with all the parts that they're going to be. So that's one of the reasons, or I'd say kind of the main reason why I just basically went 80% on my shifter adjustments. That was really to confirm that everything's good, that everything's working, and then I could move on with full final reassembly. Then the very last thing I'm going to do on the car is actually run through the shifter adjustments properly to make sure I have them dialed in. So I'm going to take a couple minutes, get all of these components reinstalled back in the car. Then I'm going to turn my attention to our shift paddles. We need to get those unbolted from the steering column and removed. And we have these plugs that come with the kit that go in their place to cover up the holes on the steering column trim. I'm going to try to remove the steering column trim and see if I have enough space to turn the wheel to get to the mounting hardware to get these pulled off without removing the steering wheel. I know I mentioned earlier in the video I was going to remove the steering wheel. I decided not to, and I'm going to see if I can still get away with not getting the steering wheel removed to get these off. My plan of attack is to get that stuff reassembled, then I'm just going to jump straight over to the paddles on the steering column. I'm going to work to get them installed, just like everything else we've been doing. Anything that's worth talking about or highlighting, I'll come back, show you guys, and get those taken care of. And that's going to conclude the inside of the car. Really, that's going to conclude most of the work on this conversion, other than bleeding the E-diff, final adjustments on the shifter, and bleeding the clutch. So I'm going to jump to those items, and I'll see you guys back here in a second. All right, so the center console went together exactly as we'd expect. The factory gate looks great. Just a little bit of trimming on that top carbon fiber piece, and we have a completely OEM factory looking appearance. It is quite fantastic. Ran through the gears initially at the new gate. Everything still seems fine, so we'll see if we need to make any further adjustments, but everything seems pretty good right where it's at. You might be able to notice shift paddles are removed, and we have our block off plates in. Get a little light for you so you can see right there. Now to do this, really my plan went as I hoped. I was able to remove the 5 Phillips head screws that hold the bottom steering column trim to the steering column and the upper trim. I removed the bottom trim out of the car. The upper piece I just left here, and I was able to turn the steering wheel 90 degrees left and right respectively. So I turned it 90 degrees left. That gave me access to get in right over, pretty much right there where our mounting hardware was. So I'm coming in from over here to get my tooling. So the shape of the steering wheel, once you turn it 90 degrees, it exposes the hardware so you can get them out. I will tell you guys that hardware, it's held in. It looks like there's a little bit of Loctite on the screws, but they're very small 2.5 millimeter Allens, and they really want to round out on the head, so they're pretty tight. You don't have great tooling size for the torque that's needed to remove them, so be careful. I actually ended up taking a long extension, putting it on my Allen bit so that way all my tooling came out past the steering wheel, and I actually had a small stubby ratchet that I was using to twist my Allen bit with, and a small little screwdriver to tap on the back of the head of the ratchet, which kind of gives it that little bit of shock as I'm twisting it, and that helped it break free. I knew that if you ram the head of that screw, it's going to make so much more work for yourself, where you're going to have to pull the airbag, pull the steering wheel, and then deal with the strip screws. So I was very cautious to be sure that I didn't do that, and we got it taken care of. So as for the conversion on this car, I have all the components in. It's pretty much ready to go with the exception of bleeding the clutch master cylinder. I also need to bleed the E-diff. That's separate from when I had the transmission out. But as I mentioned, I'm also doing a biannual service on this car, and I need to lower the car as well. So I'm actually going to stop and complete those other tasks on the car because it's just better for me workflow wise. And then once I have the wheels off the car and I'm running through the brake flush, I can run through and bleed the clutch hydraulic cylinder. And then at the very end of the repairs, we're going to make sure that all of our shifter adjustments are good, road test the car, and just make sure everything's great. So I'm going to focus on getting that stuff taken care of right now, and I'll see you guys back here in just a second. All right, we're back, and you can see that things look a little different here in the shop. Primarily, the 430 is off of the lift and in the rear position, so we have great access to get that car out of the shop and out on the road. It is pretty much completely put together with exception to our diffuser and also our trim for the engine bay on the right-hand side. I wanted to leave that off so I have some access to get to the F1 fluid to make sure it's set at the right level. And also I need to talk to you guys about what we can do to set and check our F1 fluid levels. So it's pretty much ready to go. I mean, I mentioned it. I finished all the reassembly since last time we talked. I finished the biannual service on the car since last time we were here. And also, we lowered the car. So now the car is sitting about 30 millimeters lower than it was before. I was able to do so by turning down the collars on the coilovers. And I also ended up taking the springs all the way off of the coilovers because the lower spring pads in this car were cracking really badly. It was something that I noted on the inspection I did on this car a while back. So once the customer requested that I lower the car, I just took advantage of it, got the parts on order, and I was able to get them installed and replaced while we were lowering the car. Made it a lot easier. So that pretty much brings us up to speed with where we're at on the 430 and really what I've been up to for the past couple days. Now, I will say that I already have gone through and bled the E-diff and the clutch master cylinder, but that was really just a workflow thing. It was just a lot easier for me to get that taken care of while I was doing the service work on the car. So I wanted to bring you guys back around so we can discuss really what I did. We'll start with the clutch master cylinder. So really, bleeding that was absolutely cake. I have had a lot of times where you go to bleed clutch master cylinders and they get air in the system, and it is really tricky to get that air out. And I'll say that this one bled beautifully. And I just use my brake pressure bleeder here and an adapter that I put right on top of the fill on the brake fluid reservoir. This is a Blue Point YA8925 adapter. This is a bleeder I've had forever. So if you're looking to replicate something like this, I would recommend just getting a Motive brake pressure bleeder. They're pretty inexpensive. I've had one before. It worked great. It did not hold up to the use and abuse of me using it daily. But for the average home do-it-yourselfer, it is a great option. And you can get caps similar to this. You don't have to get the snap-on ones. This is anodized aluminum. They do make ones that are like out of ABS plastic. They screw on and seal tight. You can pump this up. You pressurize the system. And really, once you have the system pressurized, all I did is I went back there and just opened up the bleeder nipple on the junction block on the transmission, let all the air come out till I got solid fluid, closed the nipple, and I jumped in the car expecting that to get me kind of roughly bled. Because like I mentioned, a lot of times you get air trapped in the master cylinder and it's really hard to get it out. And much to my surprise, this system was bled on the first shot. It took a matter of minutes. So that was a nice treat. So I got that taken care of, but there's one thing I will talk about on the bleeding of the master cylinder. So when we installed our master cylinder and pedal under the dash, I did a rough adjustment of our clevis that bolts to the pedal because it has that threaded rod that goes into the master cylinder. Once I got done bleeding everything, when you would push the pedal, you were immediately moving the clutch master cylinder with that clevis, but you could feel that you're creating no hydraulic pressure. So it basically was creating maybe half an inch of free play in the pedal. So I anticipated this. I left the jam nut on that loose. Once the system was bled, I went and then adjusted that clevis to adjust that free play out of the system. So that free play that we were feeling is actually in the clutch master cylinder itself. So I adjusted it so as soon as you start to push the pedal, you're actually creating hydraulic pressure and it's starting to actuate the clutch. It's a small detail, but it's really things like getting that adjusted properly, getting the pedal stops adjusted properly to where the pedal sits where it should, it stops where it should, really spending your time getting the shift cables adjusted properly. All those little small details make a big difference on how the overall conversion feels. Usually, I feel that if those details aren't taken care of, things don't feel, it doesn't have that factory feel, right? So small details, the customer probably won't notice that I spent the time doing it. Maybe he wouldn't notice if I wouldn't have done it ahead of time, but it overall will just give him a better feel and more satisfaction with the installation of the kit that he has. All right, so now that we covered the clutch master cylinder bleeding, let's jump over and start talking about our E-diff. Since I had the system open when I was doing the repairs, I needed to go back through and bleed the E-diff. And if you jump back to the videos where I was doing the transmission, I kind of talked about it where there's ways to get the transmission out and keep your E-diff system sealed. But either way, with removing the rest of the F1 system and hydraulics on the car, it would be a no-brainer for me that I would want to go back through and make sure that that system is bled. So, E-diff. One thing to keep in mind is the logic of the F1 pump is much different now than it was beforehand. And that is because in the original configuration, the transmission control unit was responsible for activating the F1 pump. Part of that rewiring that we did in the car was we swapped it over, so now the E-diff ECU is controlling the relay for the F1 pump. So essentially our E-diff ECU is now using its logic to run the F1 pump, and obviously the TCU can't because it's removed. Now, I will say that I went in with my tester, and I am fortunate that I have a Leonardo, which is the best non-factory scan tool that you can get for these cars. And I went into the E-diff ECU to run the E-diff bleed cycle, and honestly, it didn't work. I was a little surprised by that. And I say this as in, I trust that the Leonardo is going to be able to activate it as I need to. So initially my first thought was like, maybe I didn't get the wiring done just right. Well, then I went in and I was able to manually command the pump on in the E-diff ECU with the Leonardo, and then the pump was able to turn on and run. So that kind of eliminated that possibility that it was a wiring issue. But what I ended up doing is I used the cycle to run the pump, and then I just came back here. That is our E-diff bleeding nipple right here underneath this rubber cover. I popped that off, cracked it open. I was able to bleed all the air out of the system and get that system primed and set, ready to go. All right, so I think we covered enough on bleeding the E-diff. That's pretty straightforward. I did want to come back here and take a little bit of time and talk about setting our fluid level in our F1 reservoir, because we have that accumulator back there that I talked about when we were taking our hydraulic lines off, and that can kind of come back and bite you when you go to set the fluid level. So let's go into that in a little bit more detail. So we got our reservoir back here, and I have the car. It's been off. I haven't started it. I have opened the door, but although we removed the transmission TCU. The system no longer primes the pump when I open the door. So you can take a gander in there and you can see that the fluid level is down, maybe an inch and a half below the top of the reservoir lid. And that's really what I want to talk about, because if you're just to go through and fill that reservoir all the way up, you're going to be overfilled, right? But depending on what your accumulator status is, you could be in for a big mess. So we talked about it, and we have this accumulator back here, and when the pump runs, it's going to suck down this reservoir and it fills up that accumulator. So you have to take into account the status of that accumulator when you're setting your fluid level. Meaning if you set your fluid level in the reservoir exactly where it needs to be and your accumulator is empty, as soon as the pump cycles, it's going to suck down your reservoir to fill up the accumulator and you're going to be too low. Conversely, if your accumulator is full and you put way too much fluid in the reservoir, let's say you have a completely full accumulator and you fill up this reservoir, you're going to be in for a big mess in the morning because the accumulator is going to discharge slowly overnight. It pushes all that fluid back into the reservoir. It's going to push the fluid either out of the cap of the reservoir or out our vent line right here, and you're going to have a big mess of ATF underneath the car. So it is one thing that is worth the effort and time to get that fluid level set correctly. Now, when I was working at the dealership, we actually had a special tool that we went and hooked in and measured the fluid level, and you'd use that to set the fluid level, and it was pretty handy. Not so much on 430s, but more so like 599s and 575s where the F1 reservoir is like really up at the top, or like some of the Maseratis, and you can't get a visual in there, you only can feel the depth. So that tool came in real nice. Well, I basically copied the tool with a coat hanger. So it's a pretty simple tool here, and you can see I made that little notch. I will say that this tool, if you guys want to replicate it, is, let me get my hand up here. It's 2 inches long this way, and that notch right there is 1.75 inches from this top right here. And all we're going to do is pretty basic, set our tool in, pull it out, and you can see right now that my fluid level is too high. It's about up to there, and that's because my accumulator has discharged and raised my fluid level up. So you can take the dimensions that I just gave you, you can make your own tool, you can set it in here, and you can make sure that you have your fluid level set. And this tool is made to essentially, when your accumulator is fully charged, that's where you want your fluid level at, which is probably going to seem a lot lower than you initially think. Now, we talked about this when I was doing the hydraulic, plugging the hydraulic lines on the reservoir back here. But if I move this and get my hand on the back, you guys can see that plug. Let me get you zoomed in. Right there, you guys can see that little bolt right there with the yellow paint I got my finger on. So that little bolt right there is a valve that relieves all of the pressure from the accumulator and is going to put any fluid that's in the accumulator back into our reservoir. And that's really why I took the time to show you guys that when we were doing our lines, because you had such great access to see it. But I use that as a way to verify that I have the proper fluid level, meaning if we release that screw, drain all the pressure out of the accumulator and put all of our fluid back in the reservoir, we can be sure that we don't have too much fluid in the reservoir to where it's going to push the fluid out overnight. So it's kind of a redundant way to check your fluid level. The tool is easy enough to make. Any of us can make that and use that. But this way you can also do it to where you can release all your pressure, push all the fluid in. And I like to do this after the car's been ran and it's hot, because the fluid will have a tendency to expand. But it's a verification of like, okay, my fluid level is good when my accumulator is primed. Everything's happy in the reservoir. Let me discharge the system, push the fluid back in. Okay, I'm good. I'm not overfilled. It's not going to push out, because a lot of times, from a technician standpoint, I would finish the car, get everything done, you give it back to the client, everything's great. The last thing in the world I want is for that accumulator to discharge on his garage floor if I had it overfilled and it made a mess in the client's garage. So that's why I'm so, say, redundant on checking this, because it's quick, it's easy, and it's just a kind of a sure bet, safe way to be sure that, you know, everything's set right and I don't cause a mess that we don't want. So we'll get our light in here. Get this. All right, so I'm just going to use a stubby 8mm wrench, and I just come in around from the back side. I can get it onto our little bolt right there for our valve. And if you see the fluid level, this won't move a whole lot because it's already partially discharged, but I can do that, and you can see that our fluid level comes up. And we'll make sure this is opened all the way. All right, and I'm gonna close this up real quick. All right, so it's closed, and now you can see that our fluid level is very full. It's almost to the bottom brim of the reservoir right there. So it's really worth the extra minute or two it takes just to release all the pressure in the accumulator to push that fluid back in the reservoir, because it's a bit deceiving, right? We had our fluid set at 1 3/4 inches below the top of that reservoir. So you think you have tons of space and a lot of room for air, but once that accumulator discharges, you can see that there's not a whole lot of room in there for extra fluid. And if we're off just by a little bit, we're going to end up with an overflowing situation. And keep in mind, this fluid's cold, so when it's warm, it will expand some, so I'm going to have even less space up there. So that's that one trick that it was important for me to show that to you guys, because it's a quick, easy way. And I can tell you, as someone who has overflowed many F1 systems and made that mess, it's a lot easier and it's actually quicker to go through and double check it this way than it is to push the fluid out and have to go through and clean up the mess. So that pretty much has us covered on our bleeding of the clutch master cylinder and of the E-diff. Really, the only thing we have left to do at this point is get the car out on the road, get it on our test drive, and see how great the car is with this gated 6-speed. So far it's driving really nice, moving through the gears pretty good. We got that nice sound, gated shifter, pretty good. See how it shifts a little higher RPM, nice and smooth. Still want to take it easy on it because it has that brand new clutch. But I want to be sure that when we get the RPMs up, we're able to move through the gears nicely, make sure our adjustments are good. And so far, it's nice. No warning lights. It's driving good. 5th. 6th gear. Such a different experience going from the F1 to a manual. Really just increases the driver engagement and your involvement. Big difference. So we'll get off the freeway. Downshifts are nice. And really, I want to make sure I don't have any weird sounds, clunks. You know, we had the gearbox out of the car. We had quite a bit disassembled. I did lower the car, so I just really want to make sure the car is driving good and driving as it should, no warning lights. And really, the most important thing, we want to be sure that the car is shifting through the gears smoothly, flawlessly, and that it really feels like it was a manual from the beginning. So I have it in sport mode. We'll just switch it up in the race mode, see how much different it drives. So far, like the drivability of the car, or like the throttle actuation, feels pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. It feels a lot sharper when it's in race mode, which it should, but I think it's one of those things you don't realize as much in an F1 car because you're not really trying to, you know, heel toe it. When you're slowing down, the car is doing everything for you. So now that it's a stick shift, you can actually feel the difference quite a bit from switching from sport to race mode on the Manatino. And I will say that I prefer it in the race mode. It just feels more natural from what I would expect out of the throttle. such a difference. Incredible difference. It just really transforms this car. It's like a whole nother car. It's not too bad of a little road we have here, considering we're in a pretty urban environment. You know, I'm able to fluctuate my speed quite a bit on this road pretty naturally, so it's easy for me to get quite a few gear shifts and changes, which is one of the reasons why I like it. You know, we're not going too fast, but at least we can run through the gears, get some gear cycles on it, and really just see how this transmission's performing. So far, it's running flawlessly. I think all of our adjustments are spot on. Moving through the gears and the gates, smooth as one could expect. So one of the other things the client had me do to this car that we didn't cover in any of my videos is I put in a Forza exhaust bypass controller, so I'm able to open and close the exhaust. We had it closed for the first part of the drive. I just cracked her open, so we just have a little remote on the keychain, and you can hear right there, I'm able to go from closed. Right there is closed to open. And on this setup, you can actually bypass the factory logic, so you can keep them closed at all times, which was one of his complaints on this car, because the way he was driving the car, he was kind of right at the threshold for the exhaust valves to open and close, and they were cycling as he was driving the car. And he would like it to where they just would remain closed, not open. And that Forza kit allows us to bypass it, keep the valves closed at all times, or open at all times, or have the factory operation. Such a difference. Such a difference. Now this is the first 430 or 360 that I've gone through and converted myself. I will say that I have driven one other 430 that has been converted. I don't know what kit was in that car. I do know that it was not a Cambio Manuale kit. On that particular car, I actually had to run through and do some shifter adjustments as it was having trouble getting in and out of second and third gear at times. And I'll tell you that on that particular kit, it really was touchy and took a lot of fine tuning, and it was half a turn on a turnbuckle at the back of the actuator would put that transmission to where it would not shift. You do half of a turn and it would shift pretty well. It was pretty intermittent, pretty funky. So with that experience, I was actually not so much looking forward to getting into the adjustments on this kit, because I kind of figured it was going to be more of the same. I thought I was going to spend quite a bit of time wrestling with that adjustment to get good fluid shifts, and I am pretty happy to say that so far we have hit every shift. It's gone in and out of the gate smoothly, as one would expect. So I don't know if that's just part of the installation of the kit itself, but I can tell you that I am very pleased with this kit so far. It has done everything that I wanted. It installed quite easily and nicely, and it drives like a factory gated 6-speed. Alright, getting on the freeway once again. Again, we'll get some high RPM, but we're not going to put a lot of load on that fresh clutch. 7,000. Buttery smooth. So I keep mentioning that this is a new clutch. I want to run it through the break-in period. I don't want to put a lot of load on it. Normally I really wouldn't want to run it up to that much RPM, but I want to make sure that we have good shifting on this kit. So it's a bit of a compromise, but I'm certainly not going to run this car full throttle through the gears. I'll let the customer run through the break-in miles on the clutch. If by chance he has any complaints about shifting when he's under more load, he can bring it back to me and I'll run through any adjustments. But I think that the clutch break-in and long-term life of the clutch for me is much more important. So I want to be sure that we're driving the car in a manner that we can be sure that we set the customer up for the best long-term success. Traffic sucks. Really does. Good day to be out on the lake today, nice and warm. Wouldn't mind that myself. What a successful road test, guys. I can't tell you how excited I am on how well the car performed. It shifted through every gear flawlessly, easy shift engagement, beautiful sounds from the shifter. Our clutch operation was fantastic. No warning lights. I mean, it was just dialed on the first shot, which is absolutely outstanding. I'm very, very pleased with the results. So I have done a little work since we got back. I brought the car back in the shop, and the first thing I did, since it was hot and it was still running, I went through and I confirmed my oil level since we had all the oil out from the gearbox being out of the car. And we did do a biannual service. So when these cars are running at idle, fully up to temperature, I set the oil at the minimum mark on the dipstick. Got that taken care of, went through and just confirmed our F1 fluid level, really just gave the car a good look over, confirmed everything was taken care of, where it needs to be, and set and ready for the client. I worked to put the remaining engine bay trim back in, we reinstalled the diffuser, and I also went through and got the car cleaned up for the client. Definitely not going to give him back a dirty car. So, really, at that point, this car is pretty much ready to go back to the client. The only other thing I did do is I did come back, hooked up the Leonardo, went through and did a scan, and you can see that we have a very happy electronic system in the car, so there is no faults whatsoever in this particular car. I would be more so focusing on anything drivetrain related, since we removed the TCU from the car, and it communicates with a lot of other control units on the car, specifically both engine computers, both Motronics, your ABS control unit, your EDIF control unit. They have a lot of communication via CAN systems, so the fact that we were able to get that removed, use that TCU delete box, and we don't have any CAN faults within the system, and really the entire car is unaware that it's removed, is absolutely fantastic. That's great, because you don't want any phantom faults in there, because maybe the car goes to someone else, they have to diagnose an issue, and they're completely unaware that it's been converted, and that those faults are just kind of a result of the modifications that have been done, and they could chase them or put them to go down the wrong road and chase their tail. So I'm very pleased that we have no faults in the car and everything is set and ready to go. And honestly, guys, it's time to get this car back to the client. So I wanted to take a second and give you guys my thoughts on this converted 430, but also specifically my thoughts on this Cambio Manuale kit. Now I realize some of you guys might be new to the channel, so I'll give you a bit of background on myself for context. But I actually spent 10 years as a master technician and shop foreman at a Ferrari dealership, so I have a tremendous amount of experience and seat time in these cars. And I'll tell you that there are some F1 cars that I actually kind of like and almost, I would say, prefer. The ones I put in the prefer category is like a Scuderia or a 599 GTO. But those cars are very special and kind of in their own category. As for the later F1 cars like this 430 that specifically have the clutch pressure sensor installed on them, those cars I found drive a lot more naturally, specifically with the clutch engagement, and they're a lot more enjoyable. They're kind of to the point to where I don't have a dislike for the F1 system. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm always going to prefer a stick shift, but the later F1 cars I think are pretty manageable. And then if you start going backwards and looking at the 360s and even the 355s, those very early F1 systems, really, I can kind of get used to the shifting of them, but I personally just have the biggest issue with the clutch engagement. It feels very robotic. It doesn't feel natural. The computer isn't able to engage the clutch as well as a human in all situations, and I just find that those cars aren't as enjoyable to drive as their gated counterparts are. Now, we all know that the factory gated 430s are incredibly rare. I'll say at our dealership, we probably had maybe 2, maybe 3 cars locally that were actually a factory gated 430. So it was very rare even for us to see those come through the doors of the dealership. I say this as in, you got to think that nearly all of my experience, or all of the percentage of time that I'm driving a 430, has always been an F1 car. Yes, I've driven plenty of stick shift 430s, but if you look on the proportion of how many F1 equipped cars I've driven versus stick shift, it's massively skewed. I'm bringing this up because my body and my senses are so used to the 430 experience being an F1 car. And when I get into one that's been converted like this one and I drive it, it takes a little bit for me to readjust, because I'm hearing the sound of the very familiar deep sound of the 430. I have everything around me visually. I'm in a 430, and I just kind of subconsciously am expecting an F1 car. But I can tell you that I just drove this car after all this work, and it felt very natural, and it was probably one of the first times that I've driven a gated 430 where it just felt so natural. I don't know if it's because I've been thinking about this test drive during all the work building up to it, but it really felt great. And kind of back to my earlier statement, where any car that's a stick shift is going to increase the driver engagement. So it's going to make you be focusing on what you're doing more. You have to be more involved with the driving experience, which the way I always rate my favorite Ferraris is the feeling that they leave me when I get out of the car. So it's really just that feeling I have when I finish a test drive and I get out of the car and I'm just like, man, what an amazing experience that was. What a test drive. Or there's other cars where you get out of and they just don't hit you quite the same way. I can tell you that any gated Ferrari is going to hit you a little bit harder than the F1 cars. Well, it is time for me to get this 430 delivered back to my client, and honestly, I'm very excited to get it back into his hands and hear what he thinks of all the work that we did to the car. That's going to be the most rewarding part of this project for me. If any of you have an F1 equipped Ferrari that you're considering getting converted into a gated manual, jump in the video description and I'm going to leave my contact information there. I am located in the Pacific Northwest, specifically the greater Seattle area. So if you're relatively close to me and you want to get your car up here, maybe get it converted, heck, you never know, get it on the channel and have it featured here, reach out, let me know what kind of project you have in mind, and we'll see if we can get something worked out. With that, guys, as always, I greatly appreciate the support. Thank you very much for watching the video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.